There was a migration from Atlantis to Giza in the year 10,500 BC, and that they built the Great Pyramid between 10,490 and 10,390 using anti-gravitic magnetic technology. Gravity, he said, was an octave of vibration, and if you could use the night side forces, you could decouple through sound frequencies heavy objects from their natural Earth resonance, and therefore they would float through the air. The story Plato told originated in Egypt. When you talk about pre-dynastic Egypt, you're talking about the Atlantean legacy. Edgar Cayce, who was an uneducated man, but in a hypnagogic trance had access to the Akashic records and accurately diagnosed thousands of people remotely, said specifically, there was a migration from Atlantis to Giza in the year 10,500 BC, and that they built the Great Pyramid between 10,490 and 10,390 using anti-gravitic magnetic technology that levitated the stones. This is before Robert Bauval ran the numbers in his computer, where he determined that the constellation Orion exactly points at the tips of the three pyramids at the year 10,450 BC. Edgar Cayce said that literally is the exact date that Robert Bauval later discovered through computer programs that showed this is where these stars would be at this time. That's an extraordinary coincidence. And then also, like you go back to the Egyptian Turin Kings list, and it's like we just like to ignore that because we say, well, that's just made up. Because it predates and it basically says that there was a group of kings that go back to the island in the west, or the place in the west, in the time called Zep Tepi, the before time, the dream time, when everything, the Isle of the Blessed, the Golden Isle. And they put that date roughly at 9800 BC for the end of that lineage and the beginning of this new lineage of pre-dynastic. And they even refer to them as the Auletians or Auretians. That's close to Atlanteans. And it's not like Atlantis is the official word. We don't know what they called themselves. We just have words whose etymology changed. The Aztecs, for example, talk about we come from the place called Aztlan. They call it Aztlan. In other places, they call it Atla or Atlas, Atlantis. For the Egyptians, it's something different. It absolutely must be the same place. And it explains why all these cultures that we think were totally unconnected until Columbus. For example, you can't explain how the Greeks have a titan called Atlas who holds the world aloft, and the Aztecs have a god called Atlanteotl who holds the skies aloft. How is that? They were never connected officially, and yet it's true. It's this Atlas Atlanteotl. Of course, it makes sense because you're talking about there was a proto-Greek culture, a proto-Aztec culture, basically a proto-everything culture that was global and at times had high technology, at other times went through the same cycles we went through. This is, again, we're talking about a 50,000 years of history here, according to Edgar Cayce. We don't have any comparison to that because we don't have a culture that's 50,000 years old in our recorded history. So it's extreme to us to think that there could even be a culture that lasted that long. A kid who was 17 years old in 1882, which is the Wild West, where electricity had just been introduced. There's no television, there's no cell phones, there's no computers, there's no cars, there's no airplanes. And yet he describes cars, he describes smartphones, he describes holographic computers, he describes video surveillance, he describes cigar-shaped flying objects. And he's telling the story. According to Frederick Oliver, he got this message from living near Mount Shasta, which is a sacred site. And he said, I started to hear and occasionally see this presence that called itself Philos, that was an consciousness from Atlantis that said, I want you to tell my story, dictate what I say. So he was not in a trance like Edgar Cayce. He was awake, hearing a voice clairaudiently. And I know this sounds ridiculous. It sounded ridiculous to me when I read the preface to his book. as a mainstream regular historian, I was like, what is this? So I just pretended, let's just take it at face value. A kid at the frontier started hearing voices and wrote a 450-page book of Atlantis. Let's see what it says. It's unbelievable what he said, because what he said was, I'm telling the story of a guy who lived in the year 11,160 BC. That was the exact date. On the Isle of Poseid, which is the same name Edgar Cayce gave it, in the capital city, the circular city Plato described, and he called that city Kaiful. And to my knowledge, that's the only time that name has ever been mentioned, was the capital circular city, Kaiful. And he even names the name of the river. He calls it the Nomis River, that circular river that has the inlet to the ocean. So I found a lot of details that I have never seen anywhere. Then he describes the science of the time, like in a non-simple way. Like you would think you're reading the notes of Nikola Tesla when you read this book. He gives a kind of bird's eye view and then a very detailed ground level view. In fact, he's the only channeler I've ever seen that gives a day-to-day, what would it be like walking through the streets of Atlantis in 11,160 BC in the capital city of Kaiful. And it's unbelievable because he's like, this is what the university system was like. This is what the government land grant application looked like in Atlantis. And it actually, it makes total sense how he's describing this. And he's like, this is what religion was like in Atlantis. We didn't believe in any special one son of God. He's like, to us, the son was God. But we did believe that at one time, Incal, which was the solar sun, did have an incarnation on Earth. You know, so Jesus was the Son, literally, embodied in a person that we call the Son of God. But then he describes, like, the power source. You must be wondering, as you come to uncover all of our marvels around the world, like our pyramids, how did we do this? We must have used slaves. We must have been a brutal culture. You know, because that's what your limited mind would be thinking in 1860 when you still have slaves basically during the Civil War. But we had the most advanced cutting tools. We had the most advanced scientists. And we used a different version of science than you. So he's like, you guys have a periodic table where you separate everything. You're obsessed with separation, where in fact there's just one substance that permeates the universe. And everything is a vibratory deviation of the one substance, but it's all one. It's just as easy for us to make silver and gold as it is for you guys to make concrete. He's like, we could just take red clay and run it up to the, what he calls chemical milepost of aluminum and transmute it. Not through magic, but through a scientific process where we just change its vibratory speed and it becomes aluminum. And he's like, one day you'll discover how to do that and you won't have any lack of resources. But you don't understand that because you're still thinking that everything is separate when there's just one thing. It was a very interesting, like, sophisticated way of explaining kind of what Tesla, which makes sense because he was a reincarnated Atlantean according to Cayce, was trying to bring back, but that, you know, Westinghouse and Edison and Rockefeller ultimately put the can on him because you can't monetize that. So we got stuck with that model of scarcity and quote unquote fossil fuels and all this other 19th century crap that we really haven't updated. You know, I mean, we got electric cars that catch on fire, but in Atlantis, the way that they described it was basically everything was entrained to natural earth rhythms. So like the pyramid was a harmonic resonator, kind of like how Christopher Dunn discovered the Giza plateau probably was using piezoelectric harmonic resonance to pull energy from the earth and emanate it through the capstone. And also it could prevent seismic activity. It was a stabilizing factor, but it also was a power generator through earth currents. That's kind of how he describes the power source. And Edgar Cayce, it was a crystal, a huge crystal in a tower with a retracting dome that could collect stellar and solar and planetary light, store it in battery cells, and then wirelessly project that energy into the sky. And these flying machines without wings could entrain to guide paths that were predetermined, and the crystal would basically guide you to the destination, like on a flight plan. Frederick Oliver described this in 1882. That's unbelievable. So I say to myself, look, like, I'm an investigator. So when did this book get published? It got published after he died in 1905. So that's the latest anybody could have added anything. And it's like, well, we still don't have any of the things he's talking about in 1905. So I take it quite seriously, because in that book, he also tells things that are confirmed by science. So, for example, he says in one part, he's talking about flying around the world in the aluminum cigar-shaped flying machine that can go underwater and in the air and is powered by the night side forces. And he's coming back from a diplomatic mission from India back to Atlantis, to Kaiful, and he says, you know, on the way back, we're going to stop in North America, which he called Incalia. And he says, Incalia was very different back then. It's not the way it is today. Very cold, much colder. Again, this is a 17-year-old uneducated kid in a cabin in Washington in 1882. And he's like delineating exactly where the ice cap would have ended at that time, which we now know was like Dayton, Ohio. And he's like, much colder back then. In fact, this is how cold it was, you know? And it's like, I took every single thing he said, Sen, and I looked at it. Like, is there any evidence that what he said was true? And it's like, time after time after time. He says, we're flying over the Amazon, but a very different Amazon at that time. He says, as a matter of fact, around 10,500 years ago, we transplanted a lot of plants from Atlantis to the Amazon. So rather than being a pristine garden like you think it is, it's actually it's an Atlantean botany project that we used to cultivate crops. Would you believe that 2 years ago, a team of scientists that was reported by the BBC wrote an article, and it said, much to our great surprise, we discovered people have been farming in the Amazon since 10,000 BC, it's likely. And it appears that most of the plant species here have been transplanted from somewhere. He said that in 1882. Nobody knew that then. And on and on and on. He talks about, we're on our way back to Atlantis. We're going to stop in our copper mines in the Lake Superior region of Upper Michigan. We now know that there's over 3,000 unexplained copper mines with Phoenician and Minoan markings on strange tools that are not Native American that produced more copper than exists on Earth in museums from that era. And even mainstream historians have said somebody was mining copper here at least 4,000 years ago in Michigan. It wasn't Native Americans, and we don't know where the copper went. And a kid in 1882 says it was an Atlantean mining project, and we took it all back to build the walls of Atlantis, just as Plato described them being coated with tin or a calcum, which is mountain copper, gold, etc. So it's like time after time, this strange book proved out when I corroborated it with mainstream sources. That sunken city off the coast of Cuba, you can't say that's not part of the Atlantean Empire, because anything in the Americas that we find conclusively to 10,000 plus BC would have been within that Atlantean colonial period. Because in Frederick Oliver's story, there were Atlantean settlers in Arizona in 12,000 BC, using cigar-shaped flying craft to land in what he called Lake Mitti, which again, there is a place called Lake Bonneville, which would have been an ancient inland sea. And it's now a salt flat. But that 12,000 years ago was a huge inland sea. And in Frederick Oliver's story, he says, oh, Lake Mitti, I miss you. Because 12,000 years ago, this wasn't a desert. It was a beautiful inland sea filled with Atlantean colonists on the beach. If you look at the Sphinx, as my great colleague Rob Nyland has, I would argue, proven beyond a shadow of a doubt, it's as a master sculptor, the original face of the Sphinx was a lioness. And it's a recreation of the goddess Mehit, who is a lioness. And what does Mehit guard? She guides, in traditional Egyptian mythology, she's the royal librarian of the pharaoh. And what did Edgar Cayce say was underneath the Sphinx was the Hall of Records from Atlantis. So again, there's an Egyptian lioness goddess who's the royal librarian, and Edgar Cayce says under the Sphinx is the Hall of Records containing all records of Atlantis from the beginning to the final destruction. So it's like, in a culture that is obsessed with mathematical precision, why would they make the head tiny and the paws big? Because it was originally a giant lioness head, as I show in my book with that great picture that Rob Nyland let me borrow, where he made a full recreation sculpture and then did a weight analysis and was like, the back of the neck of that Sphinx, which used to be a lioness, is still present on the face that was recarved by the pharaoh who was trying to get rid of the cult of Mehit and replace it with his cult. And he found evidence of that in a hieroglyphic, actually, that he and his friend Manu helped translate. I did the math the other day, Sen, and I was astounded even because Edgar Cayce said it took 100 years using levitation technology. So I did the math with that, and it was like they would have had to have been levitating 2-ton blocks every 20 minutes, one into place, for 100 years to build the Great Pyramid. Even if you could levitate it, it was every 20 minutes, bing, for 100 years. Why would you do that unless you were building something to stand the test of the coming global catastrophe at the end of the Younger Dryas? There is no king that's that delusional that would waste that much time and resources on a mausoleum. We could not recreate that structure today. Elon Musk could not build that structure today to the same tolerances. With modern technology, we couldn't do it. They tried it in the 70s. The Japanese sent a team to Giza, build a tiny scale pyramid. They're like, we can't even do that with Bronze Age technology. There's no way. According to Edgar Cayce and Frederick Oliver and many others, gravity, he said, was an octave of vibration. And if you could use the night side forces, you could decouple through sound frequencies heavy objects from their natural Earth resonance, and therefore they would float through the air. Things that don't make sense without Atlantis, like a god called Atlanteotl in the Aztec culture, who claim they're from Aztlan, and then a titan called Atlas holding up the world in Greece. That shouldn't exist if we've been separate. You shouldn't find a giant pyramid at the bottom of the Azores either. What's that doing there that looks exactly like the Great Pyramid of Giza? Well, the Azores are the mountaintops of where Poseid was, according to Plato. He said Atlantis was directly in front of the Straits of Gibraltar, where the Azores are. There's also an Atlantean king called Azaes, and nobody knows where the Azores Islands got their name. They say, well, it's because there's a bird called an Azore, but I would say it's because there was an Atlantean king called Azaes. And if you look at the oldest city in Europe, which is Cadiz, Spain, that's the modern name. Thousands of years ago, it was called Gades. And who's Gades? A king of Atlantis in one of Plato's dialogues, who had dominion over southern Spain. So it's like, where do all these things come from if there's no truth to this story? Where does the Atlantic Ocean come from? Nobody has any explanation for the etymology of that word. It's not a Greek word. And that word Atlan. But think about it. You have Atlas in Greek. You have the Atlas Mountains in Tunisia. You have the Atlan in Mesoamerica. You have the Altai Mountains. I mean, it's like, this is a word that symbolizes that there was a global awareness of this culture, and that it was centered perhaps in the Atlantic Ocean, but that it had, because of this technology, it had flying machines, it had boats, it had submarines, and it traveled around the world. How many of these sightings of USOs and UFOs and UAP, whatever you want to call it, how many of these are actually extraterrestrial, and how many of these are perhaps a breakaway or concurrent continuation culture, went to Antarctica or underground? I'm really serious about this. Like, that has actually just always been here. You wonder, like, how much of this technology really was totally lost? Because this is the great question I've always had, is like, if they did successfully, according to Casey and friends, do the Atlantis reboot in Egypt. Something happened around, I would say, maybe 7,000 BC, where like that project ended, and then this kind of the dark ages of antiquity began, and then we really had to start again from nothing as we got closer to the Sumerian times and the kind of Mesopotamia conventional times when history began again. Something must have happened where it was not a successful reboot, where perhaps there was another cataclysm or another war where the technology was destroyed or lost. We could lose our technology in 500 years. If there was a nuclear war followed by massive asteroid impacts, we would have a remembrance of a time for a couple hundred years when the internet existed and we had flying machines. But in like 6, 7, 1,000 years, it would sound like myths, because there would be no living descendants. There'd be no physical artifacts anymore. That's why we haven't found an Atlantean Wilkes, because it's made of aluminum. You know, even the good aluminum from Atlantis, the transmuted aluminum, it's still real. It's still subject to the laws of nature.